Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Trinity Long Room Hub Festival for our Arts, Humanities Research Festival. This is the final day of what's been a tremendous week, and it's a special day because we are devoting Friday to research in music. It's one of the key elements of our portfolio in the Hub, and we love it. We don't do enough, we don't talk enough about it. So I'm very pleased that you've all joined us this morning, and I want to welcome those joining us on the live stream. But particularly, I want to welcome Nicole Grimes, who has returned to Trinity, I'm pleased to say, to take up residence in our Department of Music. And Nicole is going to be talking to us today about sounding women's large-scale compositions on the music historical map. Nicole, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. History has a way of women falling off the back of it. So the Scottish author Ali Smith asserts, adding that the canonical doesn't hold on to women in the same way as it holds on to artists who happen not to be women. When listing the composers who are generally said to define the canon of European art music, we typically name Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Brahms, Schumann, Bruckner, Elgar, Sibelius, and so on. Many of you will know those names. But how many of these composers will you recognize? Francesca Caccini, Maddalena Casulana, Mariana Martinez, Madalena Laura Sermon, Louisa Franck, Emilia Meyer, Elfrida Andre, Mel Boni, or Rebecca Clark. Are we surprised by this comparative difference in recognizability? We shouldn't be. Women, and some men, have been trying to write women back into the history of music for as long as men, and some women, have been writing them out. For the last 5 years, the organization Donnée Women in Music has studied and published data on trends in programming, in diversity and equity within global classical music repertoire. Donnée Music bases these findings on a survey of 111 orchestras across 30 countries for the 2023 to 24 season. Their data shows that out of a total number of pieces of music exceeding 16,000, 9.25% were by men and 7.5% were by women. 2023 to 4 marked a disimprovement on the previous year's figures in that regard. When further broken down for race and ethnicity, 5.8% was composed by white women, 1.6% by women of the global majority, 3.2% by men of the global majority, and 89.3% by white men. Donnée Women in Music defines the global majority as Black, Asian, mixed heritage, Middle Eastern, and Indigenous. When further triangulated along living and historical composers, of the 16,000 pieces, 5.5% were by living female composers, 12.7% were by living male composers, 79.8% by historical male composers, and 1.9% by historical female composers. I'll come back to that last figure in a moment. This lack of representation of women is mirrored in the fields of music theory and analysis, disciplines which, in themselves, are male-dominated. Scholarly organizations on both sides of the Atlantic, that is, the Society for Music Analysis in the UK and the Society for Music Theory in the US, have initiatives in place to combat the underrepresentation of women in the discipline. Progress is slow, but it is moving in the right direction. Of the Donnée Women in Music data, the figure that is of most interest to my research on the music of the 19th century is that of historical women, whose repertoire made up just 2% of the 16,000 pieces of music considered in that report. The more work scholars do on equity and diversity in music, and on the representation of women in European art music, the more we are forced to admit that the historical repertoire is not actually dead white men. There are women composers everywhere, across time, shown here only for the 19th century. Nor is the problem of underrepresentation of the output of those women composers particular to our own time. The histories of women's compositions are repeatedly effaced, leaving each generation to discover women composers anew. Sophie Smith refers to the analogous effacing of women in the history of philosophy as the forgotten woman trope. It masks a major development. Since the 1980s, there has been a flourishing of scholarship produced overwhelmingly by women on historical women composers. What I show here is a very select overview of the work that has been carried out on collections of women composers. The research that has been undertaken on individual composers is too vast to possibly fit onto a slide. This is exemplified in the work that you see here, and this scholarship in turn has allowed for compositions by women to feature more strongly than they otherwise might have done in the type of music history textbook that is regularly assigned to students in the United States. As these numbers show, that representation remains lamentably low. While there has certainly been increased attention paid to women in music on university syllabi and in some publishing arenas, it remains the case that women composers are largely absent from our global stages. What sort of mechanisms are at work, as Regan Penaluna asks, that we can forget again and again that history forgets that women were there? The 19th century witnessed the near total exclusion of women from musical education institutions and from the pursuits for which higher education was necessary. They were excluded from full inclusion at musical conservatoires in the 19th century, notwithstanding the efforts of a number of prominent male figures who fought to change this. The exception to the educational rule was those women who could afford to pay for private tutelage. Behind nearly every woman composer in the period before the widespread admission of women to conservatoires and academic institutions was a man willing to provide access to an education otherwise denied. In many cases, this was a father. One such amenable gatekeeper was Friedrich Wieck, father of Clara Schumann, whose teaching and training allowed his daughter to bypass social norms and to earn enormous success and recognition during her lifetime. Another aspect of the gatekeeping is the fact that in the 19th century, women were actively discouraged from publishing their music. Much of the music of Fanny Hensel, for instance, was published under her brother's name. Clara Schumann reluctantly published a number of her own compositions during her lifetime, but her diaries show her self-consciousness and her lack of confidence in doing so. In order to get around this public expectation, many women ascribed only the first initial of their given name to their compositions, or else created pseudonyms. A famous incident in 1916 saw the British-German composer Rebecca Clark give the pseudonym Anthony Trent as the composer of her piece Morpheus for a performance at the Aeolian Hall in New York. Afterward, she explained this use of a pseudonym was the result of embarrassment at having 3 pieces on the concert program under her name. She observed, however, that although the piece by Anthony Trent was not particularly good, it had much more attention paid to it than the pieces she had written in her own name. An article in Vogue magazine on the 15th of April 1918 named the fictitious Anthony Trent, together with Frank Bridge, and you can see where this is going, as among the up-and-coming British composers. The article mentioned Clark only as an afterthought, advising that one should not overlook Miss Clark's own picturesque compositions, the lullaby and grotesque for viola and cello. Erasure, then, tends to go hand in hand with forgetting. And forgetting, as Smith asserts, presupposes something once known. But the general we who have forgotten these women are also the we who were not taught them in the first place. In neither my undergraduate nor my postgraduate education here at the Department of Music in Trinity did I encounter a single woman composer. The agents of that ignorance are the music historians and theorists who made a world in which certain musical works were deemed unworthy of preservation, with the result that the history of women's music was consistently kept to the margins. It's time for that to change. In keeping with the spirit of studies carried out in philosophy by Regan Penaluna and the history of ideas by Sophie Smith and art history by Katie Hessel, I recognize that it is part of our job as historians to point to that erasure of women and to recognize that the time has come to deal with this. Not to do so would mean that we are left with a very generic idea of woman when we study the music of the so-called great composers and the philosophers and commentators who have pronounced on that music. With all of that in mind, I'm in the early stages of a major research project called the Expansive Canvas, large-scale form in the music of women composers in the long 19th century. This is an international collaborative multi-year project. Its first major event will be an international conference and collaborative symposium co-hosted by the Department of Music at Trinity and the Royal Irish Academy of Music in association with the Trinity Long Room Hub. The dates and logistics are yet to be confirmed, so I won't mention those at this point. Large-scale form refers to the structure of an extended musical composition found in numerous genres, such as sonatas, symphonies, overtures, operas, concertos, chamber music, and extended choral works. It stands apart from the domestic genres historically associated with women composers, such as song and piano miniatures, eminently worthy genres that, notably, could be performed without access to financial and political networks, and thereby without the power structures of gender required for the composition and performance of larger works. At its most basic level, large-scale form refers to the expanse of a composition, whether a multi-movement work or a single movement. Where the analysis of that music is concerned, historical women composers face what I refer to as the double bind. In the first instance, history tells us that women did not write music in large-scale forms. Once that music is recovered, attempts to analyze it bump up against scholarly objections that the modes of analysis being applied were designed for the music of male composers, begging the, I think, legitimate question of whether modes of analysis can be gendered. The broader aims of this project are to reinvigorate our conception of music history in the long 19th century and to challenge entrenched patterns of representation within the classical music establishment by providing resources for gender diversification in scholarship, music education, and concert programming. This will be achieved through recitals and concerts, as well as through creating educational and pedagogical resources and teaching resources for junior academy and secondary level schools. The project acknowledges that the analytical field of large-scale form in musical compositions remains a subject dominated by white men. In time, as we unearth and contextualize large-scale compositions by women composers, this project will redress that gender imbalance in numerous ways. In doing so, it will create valuable opportunities for collaboration in both study and performance with industry leaders across Ireland, including the National Concert Hall, the National Symphony Orchestra and Choirs, the RTE Concert Orchestra, the Irish Chamber Orchestra, the Hibernian Orchestra, and the Irish Association of Youth Orchestras, also extending to Ireland's chamber music ensembles, both amateur and professional. As such, the project will contribute to the cultural life of Ireland in tangible and meaningful ways. This research will be, and has already begun to be, woven into research-led teaching at both the undergraduate and postgraduate levels here at Trinity, both in courses offered and in attracting doctoral students and postdoctoral researchers to work in this area. I'd like to pause at this moment because I firmly believe that a talk about music ought to have music. So we're going to pause just to allow you to hear 3 snippets from a very, very select repertoire of the music that I'm discussing here, but hopefully it's enough to fill you with enthusiasm about it. So the first excerpt is from a composer called Emilia Meyer, who lived from 1812 to 1883, almost exactly contemporary with Beethoven. And you can see the vast list of her large-scale compositions here on the slide, including 8 symphonies. And she very much broke the glass ceiling in the performance of her symphonies in Berlin in the 1850s. The piece that I'm most concerned with here is one of her 8 overtures on Faust. It's a setting of Goethe's Faust. And the reason I want to draw your attention to this piece is that many of the settings of Faust that we know musically are by male composers. And there are a number of women composers who have set this piece. And that in itself is an eminently worthy research project, because how these women composers treat that text is entirely different to many of the settings of Faust that we are used to from the canon. So I'll give you a brief insight into how that's the case with this piece, in that you will see here, this is coming to the very end of the piece. It's the last sort of major, by major I mean large scale, but also, as it happens, major cadence in this piece. It has been in B minor unrelentingly the whole way through. And finally, at the end, Meyer inserts the text from Goethe's Faust saying, "Sie ist gerettet," or "she is redeemed, she is saved." And at that point, we have this move to the major, and this is how it sounds. The second piece I'll draw your attention to is by Rebecca Clark, and it's her piano trio of 1921. Rebecca Clark was a German-British composer, and she would have had contact with Vaughan Williams at the Royal Academy and the Royal College of Music in the early part of her career. This is an invigorating piece of music. As you dash home to your gramophones after this, if you have time only to listen to one piece, make it this one. An arresting piece to that opening from 1921. The final piece I'd like to share with you today is by Louisa Franck, and it is her Nonette, written in 1846. The reason I'd like to share this with you is because it's a piece of chamber music for strings and woodwind. And that's a practice that has really fallen out of favor. It was very much in vogue in the 19th century, and it's a really fantastic form of intimate music making. Many of the instruments that we have in a symphony orchestra, but in a much more intimate setting. So we'll hear the beginning of this, of the third movement. I warn you that it starts very softly, so listen carefully, but it will quickly, the dynamics will rise. So that one in 1846. All right. So the main aims of this international conference and collaborative symposium are to explore the music history of the long 19th century as it pertains to women composers by recovering, promoting, performing, and sharing large-scale works and their cultural contexts and historical narratives. To provide a platform for the performance of this repertoire in a number of recitals, concerts, performances, and practical workshops. To create a forum for the analysis of music by women composers with a view to opening a wide scholarly discourse in this area. To explore the relationship between current and prevailing modes of music analysis and large-scale forms by women composers, and interrogate the question of which models of music analysis are appropriate to large-scale forms by women composers in the long 19th century. In other words, the research will interrogate whether modes of analysis can be gendered. Explore the interdisciplinary contexts of large-scale forms in relation to their literary, artistic, graphic, and extra-musical adjuncts and associations, as we saw in the example of Faust. Consider large-scale form in relation to women's contributions to other art forms at this time through a series of roundtable discussions, provocations, responses, and talks across the disciplines of literature, visual art, drama, dance, film, and more. Contextualize developments in research on large-scale forms by women composers in the long 19th century in relation to developments in gender studies. Consider the research and practice of large-scale form by women composers in the discipline of music education through a series, again, of roundtable discussions, provocations, and responses, and to provide outlets for public engagement, public talks, and broadcasts on the subject of large-scale form by women composers, to reach our community and invite them to be actively involved in this research. A meaningful engagement with the large-scale compositions by women composers in the long 19th century will allow us to re-chart music historical maps from this time, tracing intersections, influences, and innovations in relation to all of the music that is in conversation at this time. This will give us the opportunity to appreciate that these lines of influence are not unidirectional. My research so far shows that the music of women composers quite often gave rise to many of the developments that we consider to be innovative in the later music of their male counterparts. This will have a significant impact on the field of music education at every stage, from kindergarten to fourth level. Writing about her research in Rediscovering Forgotten Women Composers, Regan Penaluna writes, and I quote, "Some evenings after I got home from teaching in Queens, I'd sit on my loft bed and spread my notes about women philosophers out before me. I felt a strange thrill in the gesture, just like I imagined Elstob experienced hundreds of years before. I wondered what it would have been like to have heard the stories of these women thinkers earlier in my life, to have absorbed their great diversity of responses to the phenomenon of being a woman from when I was first exposed to art, literature, and philosophy. Would my life have been different? Would I have cared less about dominant cultural codes that taught me my autonomous self didn't matter?" End quote. In the music of these women composers, there is an imperative to recognize and intellectually grapple with something more, to see that these composers are pointing at something deeper, something more richly textured, something that demands the seriousness of our attention. And we encounter an imperative to allow our students to experience their autonomous selfhood reflected in the material they are taught. Returning to Dublin and to Trinity College Dublin has been a sheer joy. Upon that return, I was delighted to encounter the installation of the busts of 4 women in the Trinity Long Room. The last of these sharpened, and that is Mary Wollstonecraft, sharpened her arguments in favor of a rigorous education for girls in the last decade of the 18th century, the results of which are found both in her pedagogical manuals, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters of 1787, and A Vindication on the Rights of Women of 1792. In the Boydell Room, which is the main teaching space at the Department of Music at House 5, 3 portraits of George Hewson, Joseph Grucko, and Sir Robert Prescott Stewart hang. These continue to peer down at the students pursuing their music education in that space, just as they did when I was a student there, and I imagine when Audrey was a student there. It is my hope that the work carried out in this project will allow us to augment the collection of portraits in the Boydell Room, in keeping with the spirit of the initiative in the Trinity Long Room. In anticipation of where this project will intersect with other art forms in the 19th century, I find the work of the artist Evelyn de Morgan particularly inspiring. A painter who defied the expectations of her class and gender to become one of the most influential artists of her generation. One of her most striking paintings, Night and Sleep of 1878, depicts two figures, Night and Sleep, surrounded by poppies, symbolic, as Katie Hessel tells us, of birth and regeneration. Hessel interprets this painting as entering a new dawn, where the figure will awake to a world of equal gender rights, ready, like De Morgan, to make their mark. It is my intention that the expansive canvas, large-scale form in the music of women composers, will lead to a similar awakening in the realm of music.